I never thought my wedding day would begin with the feeling of someone squeezing my heart right in the middle of a church. I still remember that moment very clearly. I was standing behind the large wooden doors of the church, gripping my bouquet so tightly that the white rose petals were crushed in my hands. Outside, the soft sound of the piano was playing, guests were seated and waiting, and in just a few seconds, I would walk down the aisle to marry the man I love. It was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life. But then I heard my father's voice through the microphone. At first, I thought he just wanted to say a few blessings, something any father would normally do on his daughter's wedding day. But then, every word he said felt like cold knives stabbing through the door, through my wedding dress, and straight into my chest. He said I was making an unforgivable mistake. He said I was too young to marry a widower. He said I would always live in the shadow of a woman who had died. I froze completely. My mother didn't stop him. She stood there, in the very church where I grew up, where I learned to believe in love, and let my father turn her daughter's wedding into a public humiliation in front of hundreds of people. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, unable to breathe, wondering how everything could become so cruel on a day I had waited for all my life. And just when I thought I would turn around and run away, a small hand touched mine. It was Emily, David's daughter, and what she did next left the entire church in silence. Are you feeling the tension yet? Let's continue the story together. Emily looked up at me with her clear, innocent eyes and softly asked, "Are you okay?" Just 4 words, but they hit me harder than all the insults I had just heard outside. I looked down at her tiny hand still tightly holding my trembling fingers, and in that moment, I knew I couldn't fall apart. Not now. Not when David was standing at the end of the aisle waiting for me. And especially not when this little girl had placed her whole fragile heart into this day. My name is Lauren. I'm 27 years old. And just a few minutes before everything fell apart in that church, I still believed this would be the most beautiful day of my life. I was about to marry David, the first man who made me understand what it feels like to be loved in a peaceful, gentle way. He is kind, mature, and carries within him a quiet sadness that only those who have lost someone truly dear can understand. David once had a complete life, until the day his wife passed away. Since then, he has raised his young daughter, Emily, on his own, with a patience and love I had never seen before. I know many people look at our relationship and only see complications. They see a widower. They see a child who isn't mine. They see the past, the loss, and all the imperfections. But I don't see it that way. I see a good man. I see a little girl who needs more love. And I see a home where my heart belongs. That's why I was standing here, in my white wedding dress, in the most painful moment of my life, still trying to hold myself together. But the truth is, my parents never saw David the way I did. From the very first time I brought him home, I saw my mother's expression freeze when she learned he had been married before, and I noticed how long my father stayed silent when I told him about Emily. They didn't say anything right away, but I could feel their disapproval growing quietly through every meal, every seemingly casual question, every sigh when I mentioned the wedding. My father always said he was just worried about my future. He told me I was still young, that I had too many opportunities ahead to choose someone simpler. My mother was gentler, but her words cut me in a different way. She asked if I was sure I wanted to live my whole life in the memory of another woman. She asked if I could handle always standing behind a love that existed before me. And the most painful part was the way she looked at me as if I were choosing a life of lack with my own hands. I tried to explain that love doesn't always come in a perfect form, that David doesn't love me any less just because he once loved someone else, that Emily isn't a burden entering my life, but a part of the warm, kind man I fell in love with. But no matter how much I said, my parents seemed to hear only what they wanted. In their eyes, I wasn't stepping into a family, I was throwing myself into a complicated life they were certain I would regret. So when they agreed to hold the wedding in our old church, I thought it was a sign that they had finally let go of their prejudice. I wanted so badly to believe that love could soften the hearts of the people I cared about most. I was wrong. From behind those heavy wooden doors, I could hear the whispers beginning to spread through the church. I didn't need to look to imagine the faces turning toward each other, the confused, sympathetic, even curious glances. My father kept speaking, his voice steady but cold, as if he were doing something necessary, not shattering his daughter's heart on her wedding day. Every word he said made me feel like the ground beneath my feet was slowly disappearing. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick in my chest. The bouquet in my hands suddenly became unbearably heavy. Everything I had prepared for this day, my wedding dress, my vows, the smile I had tried to hold since morning suddenly felt so distant that I could no longer recognize myself. A part of me, a part of me just wanted to turn around and run out of this church. Run away from all those judgments. Run away from the feeling of having my pain exposed in front of hundreds of people sitting out there. But what hurt me the most wasn't the humiliation. It was the moment I realized my parents had planned this. They hadn't changed their minds. They hadn't softened. They had never truly accepted David. And they never really wanted me to be happy in my own way. They had simply chosen the exact moment when I was most vulnerable, standing before the largest crowd, to force me to break down and destroy everything myself. I turned to look at Emily again. She was still standing there, silent, but her small hand had never let go of mine. And in that moment, when I felt like I was about to completely fall apart, I realized something very clearly. I closed my eyes for a second, just 1 second, as if trying to gather the last pieces of calm left inside me. Outside, my father's voice had finally stopped, but the echo of his words still hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I knew that if I turned and walked away now, everyone in the church would think he was right. They would believe I had come to my senses. They would see David as a pitiful mistake, and Emily as a burden I wasn't brave enough to carry. But that wasn't the truth. The truth is, I love David. Not because I'm blind to the loss he has been through, but because I see the man he is after all that loss. I love the way he is gentle with everyone, even when he himself is hurting. I love how he speaks about his late wife with respect, not as a way to cling to the past. And more than anything, I love the way he is a father patient, warm, doing everything he can to give Emily a childhood full of love, even while he is still piecing his own life back together. I opened my eyes and looked down at the little girl standing beside me. Emily didn't say anything else. She just looked up at me quietly, as if waiting for me to make a very big decision. In her eyes, there was no doubt, no judgment, only a fragile but complete kind of trust. And it was that trust that pulled me back. Love has never been a clean, perfect, flawless story like people often imagine. Sometimes it comes after heartbreak, after loss, after emptiness that no one can ever fully replace. But that doesn't make it any less real. I tightened my grip on the bouquet, quickly wiped the corner of my eyes, and took a deep breath. When the church doors opened, the first thing I heard wasn't the piano, nor the whispers of the guests. It was silence. A silence so heavy I could almost feel it settling over the entire room. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me at once. Some were confused, some sympathetic, and some were simply waiting to see what I would do after everything that had just happened. I took a step forward when Emily gently touched my hand. She looked up at me, then toward the end of the aisle where David was still standing. His face had gone pale, his eyes filled with worry, as if he was ready to walk toward me at any moment if I needed a reason to stop. But Emily didn't let that happen. She let go of my hand, then turned and picked up a small sign I hadn't even noticed before. It was made of white cardboard, tied with a simple ribbon like a clumsy handmade craft, but clearly prepared with all her heart. No one understood what Emily was about to do. She took a deep breath, then began walking down the aisle in front of me, small steps, yet strangely steady. The entire church watched her. So did I. I forgot the tears on my face, forgot everything my father had just said, and could only follow that tiny figure walking between the rows of seats as if she were carrying something far greater than herself. When she reached the middle of the aisle, Emily stopped. Then she slowly turned the sign toward the guests. The handwriting was uneven and childlike, clearly written by a little girl. But those words made the entire room fall silent. He didn't just lose a wife. I didn't just lose a mom. Today, we get a family again. In that moment, no one could say a word. I don't know who started crying first. Maybe it was the woman in the front row. I heard a choked sob break through the silence. Maybe it was someone behind me, as soft sniffles began to spread like a quiet wave. But one thing I know for sure. Within just a few seconds after Emily lifted that sign, the entire atmosphere in the church completely changed. The words my father had spoken, which had been hanging heavily over everyone, suddenly felt small, cold, and almost cruel. No one looked at me as a girl making a mistake anymore. No one saw David as a man burdened by his past. And Emily, that tiny girl with trembling hands holding the sign to her chest, had said what none of the adults in that room had the courage to understand. This marriage is not meant to replace the one who was lost, not to erase the memory of a wife, not to start over by pretending the pain never existed. It is to let love continue to live on after loss, so that a man who was once broken can believe in happiness again, so that a child who lost her mother doesn't have to grow up feeling something is missing forever, and so that I, with all the willingness of my heart, step into that empty space not as a replacement for anyone, but as someone ready to build something new with them from what was left unfinished. I looked at my parents. For the first time that day, I saw the certainty on their faces disappear. My father stood frozen at the podium, as if he himself hadn't expected that all his carefully planned condemnation could be undone by a few uneven lines written by a child. And in that moment, I knew everything had shifted. At first, no one moved. The entire church remained in a suffocating silence, as if everyone needed a few more seconds to process what had just happened. Emily was still standing in the middle of the aisle, holding the sign to her chest, so small it seemed like a gentle breeze could knock her over. But it was that very smallness that made the moment more powerful than any speech. No microphone, no fancy words, just a child's heart speaking a truth that all the adults had been avoiding. Then I heard a clap. Just one, very soft, from somewhere on the left. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the whole church seemed to wake up. Applause spread from one row to another, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, filled with emotion and sincerity. Some people clapped while wiping away tears. Others bowed their heads, trying to hide the emotion written all over their faces. And for the first time since the church doors had opened, I no longer felt like I was standing in front of a judging crowd. I looked toward the end of the aisle. David was crying. Not loudly, but with silent tears streaming down as he covered his mouth, as if trying to keep his emotions from breaking open in front of everyone. I had never seen him like that. The man who always tried to be strong, who stayed calm for Emily, who silently carried the heaviest pain himself, now stood there, completely exposed in gratitude and love. Emily turned back to look at me. I smiled through my tears and gave her a small nod. Then she ran back and took my hand again. And this time, as we walked down the aisle together, I was no longer walking in shame. I was walking toward my family. Each step from where Emily had stood to the end of the aisle felt both longer and lighter than I had imagined. I could still hear the applause around me, mixed with soft sobs and the quiet shifting of chairs. As a few people began to stand, the sounds slowly faded, as if the world around me had narrowed down to just the three of us, me, Emily, and David, waiting at the end of the aisle with tear-filled eyes. As I got closer, I realized my hands were still trembling. David looked at me as if he had just feared losing me forever, and yet couldn't quite believe I was still here, standing right in front of him. In his eyes, there were no explanations, no justifications, no shame for what had just happened. There was only love, a quiet but enduring kind of love, one that had survived loss, loneliness, and countless days that felt impossible to get through, yet was still whole enough to wait for me at the end of this path. Emily only let go of my hand when we reached David. Then she looked up at both of us, her eyes still shimmering with tears, but this time, they were filled with hope. No one needed to say anything more. Her presence between us said everything. This was not a story about replacing someone who was lost, but about hearts choosing to love again after being broken. The pastor cleared his throat softly, his voice trembling with emotion as he continued the ceremony. And when I glanced around one last time, I saw my parents sitting silently in their seats, no longer carrying that same certainty or rigidity as before. But this time, I didn't need them to change for me to keep moving forward. I turned to David, took his hand, and smiled through my tears. In the end, my wedding didn't begin with a blessing. It began with humiliation, was saved by the courage of a child, and became the most sacred moment of my life. I thought everything would end once the ceremony was over. I believed the greatest pain of that day was confined within those church walls and my father's words over the microphone, in the stunned faces of the guests, in the moment I had to stand still while my heart was nearly breaking apart. I thought if I could just make it through the ceremony, hold David's hand, hug Emily, and go home, that would already be more than enough for a day longer than any nightmare. But I didn't know that one guest sitting near the front had recorded almost the entire moment. They didn't post the part where my father humiliated me in front of the congregation. They didn't post the harsh words that suffocated me behind the doors. What they shared online was the moment Emily walked down the aisle with that small sign in her hands, stopped in the middle, and turned it toward everyone. Just a few seconds. A child, a line of messy handwriting, a room falling silent before a simple, heartbreaking truth. By the next morning, that video had been shared tens of thousands of times. By the end of the day, it had reached millions. Messages flooded my phone faster than I could read them. Some women said they had also been opposed by their families for loving a widower. Single fathers wrote that they had cried seeing David standing at the end of the aisle. People who grew up as stepchildren, adopted children, or in blended families said they saw themselves in Emily, a child who didn't need a perfect story, just someone who truly chose to stay. And then, the most surprising thing happened. People didn't remember my father as the man who tried to stop the wedding. They remembered him as the man who was silenced by the kindness of a child. 3 days after the wedding, my mother called. I stared at my phone for a long time before answering. Not because I didn't know who it was, but because I didn't know whether the voice on the other end would hurt me again or finally say what I should have heard a long time ago. When I put the phone to my ear, there were a few seconds of silence. Then my mother started crying. She said she had watched the video. She said she hadn't been able to sleep since that day. She said that for the first time, she saw everything, not through the fear of a mother trying to control her daughter's future, but through the eyes of the people in that church, people who had clearly seen what real love looks like. My father didn't speak to me that day, but he did send a short message. No long explanation, no fancy words, just a few simple ones. Dad was wrong. I had waited for an apology like that almost my entire life. But when it finally came, I realized it didn't carry the weight I once thought it would. Not because I no longer felt pain, but because I had already made it through the worst day of my life without needing them to save me. I stood up on my own. I chose my own happiness. And more importantly, I learned that there are moments in life when you have to stop waiting for others to accept you and start living the life your heart knows is right. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. Love doesn't need to be fully understood by everyone to be right. It doesn't have to fit into your family's expectations. It doesn't have to be neat, easy to explain, or perfect in other people's eyes. Sometimes love comes after loss. Sometimes it enters your life carrying scars, memories, and responsibilities that others only see as burdens. But if it brings you peace, if it makes you want to become gentler, stronger, more honest, then it is not a mistake. It is a gift. I also learned something else. The people who hurt you the deepest are sometimes the ones who raised you, and accepting that is painful. But growing up means facing that pain without letting it turn you bitter and without letting it decide your future. I couldn't choose what my parents did on my wedding day, but I could choose how that story would end. And I chose not to let it end in humiliation. I chose to let it end with love, with Emily's courage, with David's hand holding mine at the altar. With the moment I understood that family is not only where you are born, but where people truly choose to stay, to love you, and to walk forward with you, even after your darkest days. If today you are standing in the middle of judgment, fear, and the feeling that the whole world thinks you are wrong, I just want to tell you this. Don't walk away from a genuine love just to gain the approval of people who have never lived your life. Because in the end, you are not the one who has to live with their opinions. You are the one who has to live with your choices. And I am deeply grateful that on that day, I didn't run.